This screencast is a demonstration of the reporting features in the Model Comparer for Entity Framework 4. The Model Comparer is part of the Huagati DBML EDMX Tools add-in for Visual Studio 2010. In this demonstration, we will use Visual Studio 2010, the Huagati add-in, SQL Server Management Studio, and a sample Entity Framework 4 project based on the Microsoft AdventureWorks database to demonstrate the new reporting features in the Model Comparer. Here we have Visual Studio 2010 with a sample project containing an Entity Framework 4 model based on the AdventureWorks database. This model is currently in sync with the database and with itself, something we can confirm by opening up the Model Comparer. So let's go to the Add-ins drop-down menu and select Model Comparer. This brings up the Model Comparer, showing what differences there are between the database and the model and between the different layers in the model. Let's make that one bigger. In this main view in the Model Comparer, we have three different tree views. One showing database differences against the storage model, one showing storage model differences against the database and conceptual model, and one showing conceptual model differences against the storage model. For each of these tree views, there are a number of action buttons where we can select what action to take on any differences, such as update the opposing layer, update the current layer, or ignore differences. Additionally, at the bottom of the screen we have two buttons that brings us to the settings dialogues for the settings controlling the Model Comparer and for the naming rules used when generating CSDL entities and members from the storage model. As an alternative to the tree views, we also have Report tab, where we can see a more detailed breakdown of all differences between the different layers. So let's switch to that one. Right now it shows nothing because our model is in sync and then there are no differences. Now, to make this demonstration more meaningful, let's go back to Visual Studio, where we can bring the model out of sync with itself and with the database. So now we're back in Visual Studio in the Entity Framework Designer that is built into Visual Studio, where we can, for example, select an entity and remove it. And Visual Studio will then ask us, do we also want to remove the SSDL representation of the storage layer entity corresponding to the conceptual layer entity? So we can select yes, then we have removed this entity both from the CSDL conceptual layer and the SSDL storage layer. Next, we could remove another entity only partially. So in this case, we can select no in the delete mapped unmapped tables dialog. That means we'll only remove it from the conceptual layer while it is still present in the storage layer. Then we can remove a column. So let's select the suffix column in this view and just remove it from the conceptual layer, because the Entity Framework Designer will sometimes only make changes to the conceptual layer, sometimes it makes it to both layers. Finally, we can change one column from a string with a max length 128 to 200. So now we have a couple of differences in our model between the CSDL layer and SSDL layer, and also between the entire model and the underlying database. And within Visual Studio, it's not always easy to detect these changes, because some changes are detected by the Entity Framework model validator, and some changes are left untouched and can cause various kinds of unexpected behavior at runtime instead. So let's review these differences in the Model Comparer instead. Bring up the Model Comparer. And in the main view it will display us the differences in the tree view format. we can see that there's a table in the database that is not present in the model, and we also have one entity in the storage model that is not present in the conceptual layer of the model, and that we have a username column in the error log entity that is mapped as nvarchar128 in the storage model, but string 200 in the conceptual model. And we also have one view with a suffix column that exists in the storage model but not in the conceptual model. Now, if you want to see a more detailed breakdown of this, or in a more readable format, we also have the report tab, where we can see all these differences as a report instead. So at the top of the screen, you can click on the report tab to go to the report view. And that brings up a diff report showing exactly the same things but in a report format instead. Now, first of all, it shows us that we have the AW build version table that exists in the database but not in our storage model. So it shows all the differences, or all the details of that table, with what columns it contains and the extended property descriptions of those columns and so on. Then we see that we have a CSDL member that is different from the mapped SSDL member. The username CSDL member is string 200, but the corresponding mapped SSDL member is nvarchar128. Then we have an SSDL entity that is not mapped to a CSDL entity. So it shows us all the members of that entity. Then an SSDL entity member that is not mapped to CSDL member. So it shows us the name of the entity and what members are unmapped. And finally, we again see the differences between the username column in the between the storage model and the conceptual model. Now we also have the option to print or save this report. If you go to the print button, it brings up a print preview where we can review our printout and send it to a printer if you want. Or if you close that one, we can also save it as an HTML file and then email it to somebody else or whatever we may want to do with the report. So give it a name and click save, and there we have saved it. If you want to bring the model back in sync with the database and with itself, we can do that by switching back to the differences tab. And in each of the tree views we can select the differences that we want to sync over. So in this case we can select all tables that are missing in the storage model, update SSDL, and now they are in the storage model. Then we can select all conceptual model differences and update CSDL, and now the model is in sync with both itself and the database again. And if we switch to the report tab, we can see that there are no differences listed. Click OK to save it. And we're back in Visual Studio and the Entity Framework Designer that is built into Visual Studio. So let's instead make changes from the database side of things and see how the model comparer can deal with that. So we switch to SQL Server Management Studio, and we have prepared a script that makes a couple of database changes. First of all, we change the person.contact table where we add a new column called Twitter name. Then we changed the address line columns in the person.address table from the previous nvarchar 60 to nvarchar 100. And finally, we make the product number column in the production.product table nvarchar 25 nullable instead of not null as it was before. So if we run this script instead and apply those changes to the database, so now we have changed the database. Now our model is again out of sync with the database. So we can switch back to Visual Studio, go back to the model comparer, and in the tree view we can see that we have a couple of differences. We have a new column in person.contact. The question mark shows that it's a new column. We have changed address line 1 from nvarchar 60 to nvarchar 100, and same with address line 2. And we have changed product number from not nullable to nullable. We switch to the report view. Then we see a more detailed breakdown of the same changes. So we have added a Twitter name column, nvarchar 255, to person.contact. We have changed the address line to nvarchar 100 instead of nvarchar 60. And we have changed nullability in the product number column. So it's still nvarchar 25, but the nullability has changed from not nullable to nullable. We can again bring those changes into our model using the model comparer. So we go back to the differences tab. We can select all of the differences, or we can select individual differences if we only want to bring some parts of it over, but in this case select all, click update SSDL, and all the changes are over in the storage model. And that brings up a difference between the storage model and the conceptual model, which we can again see a more detailed breakdown of in the reports tab. So it's basically the same changes, but now the differences are between the CSDL and SSDL layer instead of, as previously, between the database and the SSDL layer. So we can go back, select the differences, update CSDL, and our model is again in sync with itself and with the database. Click OK to save it. And then we're back in Visual Studio, where we can continue using the built-in model designer to make further changes or whatever we may want to do with the model. So this concludes this short demonstration of the model comparer's reporting features. If you want to try out the model comparer or any other feature in the Huagati DBML EDMX Tools add-in, you can download the trial version from www.huagati.com/dbmltools.